It's not really a secret anymore that Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, is gobbling up praise. With sites like IGN and PC Gamer giving it excellent scores, fans raging about it, with recent numbers putting it at about 5 million users, with around 1 million active subscribers, it's no wonder the game has taken off so well.
But it wasn't always this way.
There is a reason I did not play Final Fantasy A Realm Reborn, one born in terror and darkness. One that illustrates the great folly of the MMORPG. And one that perfectly illustrates Squaresoft's weird back-and-forth idea relationship. You see, over the last 6 or so years, Squaresoft has been making these really weird missteps when it comes to video games. Stuff like basing an entire trilogy in the mainline Final Fantasy series on a cardboard cutout of a woman that nobody really liked. They seem to have gotten this weird idea in their head that old-school, sort of turn-based JRPGs are on the out, and therefore we have to innovate ourselves and innovate. And when they do innovate, they very rarely come up with an idea that works.
And it is this very bizarre philosophy that has led us to the MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV.
That's right, I'm talking to you about Final Fantasy XIV, version 1.0. You see, there were some people unfortunate enough to have pre-ordered this game, and some people even more unfortunate enough to have played it for an extensive amount of time. Because Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, not A Realm Reborn, but the terrible piece of crap that came before it, was an utter and complete nightmare. I was unfortunate enough to take part in the open beta phase before deciding if I wanted to buy the game. And, oh god, it haunts me to this day.
Fuck. Oh. What happened?
Oh god, I had that Final Fantasy dream again.
Oh, it's okay. Just go back to sleep, hun.
Wait a minute. I don't have a girlfriend. Ah, fuck. Let me give you a quick overview of the interesting innovations that Squaresoft decided to bring to the MMORPG genre in the hopes of developing a new direction for the MMO. First of all, let's talk about progression. There are 2 different tracks you'll level up as you play through the game. Your class level in one of the various professions available, or your character level, which is a universal level for your character. Now, unfortunately, all of these are subject to fatigue, which slowly reduces the amount of experience points and skill points you receive for grinding and leveling and everything until you can no longer gain experience for that class. This also affects your character, so you can eventually no longer gain experience for your character either. But don't worry about it, you'll probably never hit that threshold, because fuck you. Because the primary method of leveling in Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was through levies, and levies can only be taken 8 times every 48 hours, and that includes battle levies, which are your combat quests, or guild levies or profession levies, which are your out-of-combat quests or story quests. This all greatly limits the amount of content you can do within a 48-hour period. But don't worry, you probably didn't want to fight anything in 1.0 anyways, because combat was difficult. Enemies didn't have level indicators, and you had to learn through trial and error how to kill them. Also, combat was difficult, because mastering your class required a lot of work and practice. And then, eventually, you're going to die. But don't worry, if you die, you only have to navigate 3 menus in order to return to your last link point. But don't worry, if you love menus, then we've got the game for you. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 has a ton of them. You have to navigate through menus to get pretty much everything done, including entering combat stances, and no less than 5 menus in order to go fishing every time you go fishing. If you love navigating menus, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 is the game for you. And if all of this sounds incredibly tedious, weird, and entirely off-putting, I think this gentleman would put it best.
But we tortured some folks.
With such a failure on their hands, what was Square Enix to do? They had all these assets, this whole team, but they were aimless. They had no idea what they were doing. They had over-innovated and broken the game beyond repair, or so they thought. Enter Naoki Yoshida. I'm pretty sure I didn't pronounce that right. Fans were pissed off. The game had been critically panned and was already shaping up to be a huge loss for Square, one of many in a long chain. And this is the environment that Yoshi P walked into. He had to resurrect this game from its death throes. It took 3 painstaking years of work, but they did it. They brought Final Fantasy XIV back from the brink of death and re-released it under a new moniker, Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. And it really fit, because it was quite literally a realm reborn from death. See, Yoshi P was a big fan of MMORPGs. He played things like World of Warcraft, RPG Camelot, EverQuest, all the time. And so when he came into Final Fantasy XIV, he poured all of that love into his new baby, Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. And you can see it. Final Fantasy XIV is not so much a revolution. It breaks away from the idea that Square needs to innovate, and instead feels like an evolution, a perfection of various tropes combined into a new experience. It's very different from what Square does, but it's oddly enough pretty fitting with Square's current MO. The weird Square effect. Every time they step out of the box and try something new, it's generally met with hems and haws and nobody really cares. But every time they retreat to their own ground and relive their classics and resurrect those old ideas, it seems to be very well received. So what makes Final Fantasy Realm Reborn so special? After 3 years of work, they better have come up with something way better than what was, because really, what was before was garbage. Final Fantasy XIV as a whole plays on a lot of standard MMORPG tropes. You've got your quests, you've got your hotbar combat, you got dungeons, you got raids, you got a little bit of PvP, but not much, and it's all kind of wrapped in a package that will feel immediately familiar to most players. I think the biggest innovation in this game, the biggest step it takes outside of the box for your standard MMO, is that every character can effectively be every class. This is a similar system to like Skyforge and other games like that. You can switch classes simply by switching out your weapon, and then you immediately inhabit that other class, and a single character can be every single class. Additionally, above this are specialized jobs, which are essentially a merger of certain classes. They need to be unlocked through quest chains and by leveling up certain classes to certain levels in order to gain access to their unique job-specific abilities. For example, the summoner has really cool summon monsters. They're really cool. Even crafting professions are considered their own class. Equipping something as simple as a needle will transform you into a weaver, which allows you to craft different gear. And the act of crafting feels more like you're fighting an enemy than simply watching a bar fill up. You can actively influence how your item is being made, and this can have a huge effect on the end result. This effectively allows a really fluid system of how you play your character, and every character can be very dynamic. You can change roles based on what might be needed. Although you can't change in the dungeon or the raid, you can immediately swap in and out based on what might be required by the instance or for the guild. This effectively complements one of the less interesting features of the game, which is the main story. Now, while the narrative itself is a lot more engaging than most other MMORPGs you'll find on the market these days, in that it actually includes the player character as the hero of the story as opposed to, Green Jesus, the narrative itself unlocks almost all of the side content that you do. As you move through the world and through the main storyline, you unlock things like dungeons and PvP and things like that. But you have to unlock these through the main storyline, which means if you ignore it, you're cutting yourself off from a lot of stuff. Now, the fact that you don't have to roll alts and therefore have access to this stuff even if you switch to a lower level class is good, but if you are rolling alts, that storyline can be a major time commitment and a block from effectively leveling up. Even the new Heavensward expansion content is blocked by this requirement to complete the story quests, which isn't in itself a bad thing. It does keep you informed on the narrative, but it can hold back players who want to progress further in the game faster. Combat's also something that on the surface doesn't really seem like it'd be very different from other games, but once you dig into it, is actually really heavy. There's a difference in how combat is portrayed due to a long global cooldown on almost everything you do. There's about a 2.5 second wait before you can queue up your next ability, except for on a few smaller abilities that are generally cooldowns that are off the GCD. But this global cooldown changes the way you approach combat. It makes fighting more meticulous. It means that you choose your abilities in a different way to complement this 2.5 second cooldown on all your attacks. This form of combat can feel very slow. This can be pretty off-putting to new players, and really I couldn't get my head around it for the longest time either. But eventually you do get used to it. It feels more strategic, more planned. You have to be more aware of what you're doing. You can't just mash keys like you do in World of Warcraft, which I think is a bonus. Not everybody's going to think of that the same way, but I think it is. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the difficulty of the game and accessibility. Now, that's a big sticking point for me if you've known anything about my channel so far. I do a lot of talking about progression, difficulty, and content. And that's pretty much the most important thing you can put in an MMORPG, in my opinion. It kind of sneaks these interesting hardcore elements into the game. During A Realm Reborn, there was a lot of work that needed to be done before you could get into the Binding Coil of Bahamut. It did take a little bit of time to get gear, to acquire tomes, and everything you did in the game contributed to that objective of getting into those raids, which is awesome. Heavensward seems to be following the same track a little bit, although there doesn't seem to be as much effort in getting into raids and getting to those objectives. Although we are still at the very beginning of the expansion, we'll have to see what they come up with next. Overall, all of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn systems work together to form a sense of progression throughout the entire game. From the very beginning at level 1 all the way up to level 60, you are feeling like you are advancing towards a goal. And it's great. The narrative contributes to this, the unlocking of different dungeons contributes to this, the slowly ramping difficulty of said dungeons contributes to this, with very basic level 15 dungeons being fairly easy, while higher level dungeons and trials can be pretty challenging. It sneaks this difficulty into the game in a very interesting way because you always feel like you're working towards your goal no matter what. And that's how you make long-term progressive content fun. You make it so that it's always working towards an objective. That's the biggest thing. And Final Fantasy XIV does this very well. Even running dungeons that are below your current level can be assisting you in reaching that goal. By all means, I have not completed all of the content in this game yet, but I want to. I'm actually drawn into Final Fantasy XIV, and it's managed to get my attention even so early on as it is right now. The game's fun. It's an interesting game to play, and it feels very classical. And it is one of the biggest and most impressive resurrection stories in all of gaming history. One of the worst MMOs ever made, turning around a full 180 into one of the most fun and engaging MMO experiences on the market today. Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, truly deserves its position. It is a powerful MMO and a statement of a game that can overcome even the most failed of launches. They say you only get one shot at a first impression, but this game is proof positive that second chances exist. The fact that this game has got so much love poured into it, it's a fantastic experience because of it. And I think their failure only taught them to work harder towards that goal. Because, in the end, this is A Realm Rebooted, a fantastic game. A great example of an MMO genre refined from classic tropes. And I would definitely recommend it to anyone who hasn't tried it out. There is a trial. You should go check it. Maybe it's time to give this game your second chance. Oh, shit.
What?
I had the girlfriend dream again.
You need to see someone about that, hon.